Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. From entering Parliament in 2008 to leading the country in 2023, Chris Hipkins is no stranger to the spotlight. During COVID's beginnings, he was known as a safe set of hands, tackling education, health, and becoming the minister in charge of the COVID response for a time. Now he's firmly setting his sights on election 2026, but is he confident he'll still be in Labor's driving seat when it rolls around? Today on The Front Page, Hipkins joins us to discuss the cost of living, vibes around Parliament, and whether he'll ever be able to shake COVID. First off, Chris, we had David Seymour on a wee while back. We asked him if he'd be open to working with you. He said that would require Chris Hipkins to be working. He then made an odd reference calling you Poo Midas, which I can only assume is replacing gold with poo. So is everything you touch turned to shit or something?
Oh, look, I mean, I think this is just what we're seeing from this government, you know, and the culture starts from the top. It starts from the Prime Minister, Winston Peters, David Seymour down, where they just think that attacking people, belittling people, degrading people is what leadership looks like. I don't believe that. I'm all for a bit of humour in politics, you know, a little bit of a sledge now and then where it's funny, that can add to a bit of, you know, political engagement, but they're not very funny. And they're also not very good at it. So I think they should just stick to actually doing what people ask them to do. You know, the New Zealanders wanted them to fix the cost of living crisis. They wanted them to, get the economy moving. They haven't done either of those things. Maybe they should focus on that rather than sledging other people. Well,
what about more recently? It looks like you got the Prime Minister's goat a little. He said, I'm not taking any lectures from frickin' Chris Hipkins or the Labor Party. I mean, why are you bothering people lately, Chris? Is it getting a bit testy in Parliament at the minute?
I think it's getting, the government's certainly feeling the pressure, and they should be feeling the pressure because they made people a whole lot of promises that they haven't delivered on. But I remember standing next to Christopher Luxon during the leaders' debates where he said that, you know, families with kids were going to be $250 a fortnight better off if he became Prime Minister, and they haven't identified one single family that's $250 a fortnight better off. And, you know, food prices are still going up. You know, households are still really feeling the squeeze. And so I think the government are feeling that pressure. Really, they shouldn't have made promises that they didn't intend to keep. And so I think that's why they're lashing out at everybody else. They're just trying to find people to blame for that. And, you know, on the other side, there's a lot of pressure coming on us to say, well, what would Labor do differently? Share your policies. But the point that I've been making to people is I'm not going to put policies out there unless I know that I can deliver on them, because I don't want to end up 2 years down the track and find myself in the same position that they're currently in, where I've promised stuff that I can't deliver. I think we've had way too much of that in New Zealand politics, governments of all stripes making big sweeping promises before elections and then not delivering on them. So we're keeping our powder dry on the policy front deliberately, because when we do announce it, I want to know that we can do it. And we won't be able to make that judgment until closer to the election once we see the shape the economy's in and so on.
So you basically just want to have a look at the books, maybe by next budget, and then you'll start kind of trickling out stuff. Is that how it works in an election?
It is. It's kind of about looking at the government's books, but it's also about making sure we're doing the work now. In opposition, you don't, unlike in government, you know, you don't have the entire public service doing the work for you. You've got to do the work. So we're looking at, you know, what would things cost? How would we actually deliver them? I think one of the valid criticisms of us last time we were in opposition was that we had some really good ideas, but we hadn't worked through the detail of exactly how would we do that. And then when we got into government, we found that some of the things that we'd said we were going to do, very well intentioned, we didn't have a clear plan for how we would do it. And I think the same thing has happened to this government. They've made promises with no plan on how they're actually going to do it. And I don't want to be in that position. So we're going to take our time. I know people are eager to hear what we want to do, but I'm going to make sure that when I do go out there and say Labor will do X, I can then answer all the questions about it, and I can tell people how we're going to do it so that they know that the promises we're making are credible and ones that they can rely on us delivering on.
Well, Mr. Speaker, hasn't it been a shambolic year for the Labor Party, hasn't it? And I have to say, has there ever been a leader of the opposition with less substance than Chris Hipkins? Because what you get is a lot of carping, what you get is a lot of points of order, and you get a lot of wishy-washy, don't you? It's a lot of wishy-washy. Because beneath it all, they have no policies, zero policies, and they have no plan.
What is something that the party's tinkering away in the background at the moment?
We're looking at a lot of things. I mean, I think if you look at what is important to us, I said when I took over from Jacinda that I wanted to see Labor get back to the core sort of things that are important to Labor.
Back to basics.
Back to basics. Jobs. It's in the name of the Labor Party. That's what the Labor Party was founded on the basis of. Good jobs that mean people get well paid and can have a better life. That's why the Labor Party exists. So that's got to be front and centre for us. And at a time when unemployment's going up, jobs is very, very important. So jobs, health, because if you don't have access to good quality health care, then your options in life are going to be limited. And homes. Everyone deserves a place to call home. And if you look at so many of the other issues we deal with, it stems back to one of those three things, or sometimes a combination of those three things not being where we need them to be. So, kids not going to school. Well, if your family's moving around houses all the time because they haven't got, somewhere that they can put down roots, that's actually a big part of the problem. Kids who are getting into trouble, in many cases, it's because they're living transiently. So let's make sure everyone has a home. And then I think more recently, we were expecting that once inflation was back down within the target band, that cost of living would sort of drop off the radar almost. It hasn't. Cost of living's getting worse. So I think we need real action on the cost of living. And it's going to have to be more than just shouting at supermarkets and shouting at banks. It's going to have to be things that government can actually do that will tackle the cost of living for people.
Well, when it comes to that, I was doing some research about it. And how do we make sure that the price of butter doesn't get anywhere any more ridiculous? Do you know what I mean? In the Great Depression, I know that the government introduced subsidies for farmers and agriculture. That kind of dropped off in the 70s and 80s. Why can't we do something like that again?
Ultimately, we do live in a global market for that. And the real challenge for us is if we started to do that sort of thing here, we potentially limit our ability to then sell into the international market. It would compromise our ability to trade internationally if we bought back subsidies. I think there are real questions about, are New Zealanders paying too much for butter? Everyone's fixated on butter. I've never spoken so much about butter in my life as I have in the last week. But again, the government sort of shouting at Fonterra is not going to solve the problem. I think there are real issues around the supermarket sector, around whether we've got enough competition in the supermarket sector. But again, just talking about it, admiring the problem, it's not going to solve it. So what's the government actually going to do in that space to get better competition in supermarkets? And how are we going to support New Zealanders to have a higher standard of living? Prices will go up and down. If you think about fruit and veggies, for example, the weather has an impact. We had a cyclone in the first few weeks that I was Prime Minister that wiped out a huge amount of our fresh produce across the east coast to the North Island. And that meant that actually was one of the things that forced up fruit and veggie prices. The government couldn't fundamentally change that. But we do have to make sure we're supporting families through, what is a really tough economic cycle at the moment. So looking at their incomes, looking at how we can, contain other costs. Public transport, which the government have cut subsidies for, is going up hugely. Families on low incomes are more likely to rely on public transport. And now they're finding that their cost of transport, the cost of getting to and from work is going up. That's money that they then can't spend on food. So for those families that are living hand to mouth, everything matters. And regardless of what the price of butter is doing, the real question is, what's the overall family expenditure doing? Because are there other areas where we can ease some pressure on families? And things like public transport, they're good examples of things governments can do.
The Greens approach. What about free dental, free GP visits, and what was the third? Free childcare. Seems like a good idea.
So if you look at what we were talking about at the last election, we had a plan to start delivering free dental. The reason that we were setting that out over a period of time is we don't have the dentists to be able to just, turn on a tap and say, right, dental's free. That would be hard because we wouldn't have enough dentists. So over time, it's absolutely achievable. I did this work as Prime Minister to identify, yes, we can have free dental here. In the case of GP visits, I wouldn't necessarily start there. I do think that making it easier to go to the GP is really important. So we might not get to free immediately. At the moment, it's costing some families $100 for a GP visit. I don't think that's okay. I think we've got to deal with that. But there's things that we can do even before that. We abolished the $5 co-payment for prescriptions because if people were not picking up their prescriptions, they were more likely to end up having to go to a GP or go to a hospital emergency room than if they went to the pharmacist, got whatever medications they need and stayed healthy in the first place. So we did more than just that. We also said to pharmacists, you can give out some medications without prescription for winter ailments. And as a result, because people could go to the pharmacy, they didn't end up going to the doctor because they didn't need to. And I think there's a lot more we can do in that area. You know, pharmacies do an amazing job around the country. When I became Minister of Health, briefly, I learned so much more about what pharmacists can do. And I think that those opportunities to provide better preventative health care are just all over the place. Keep people healthy and the health system will be under a lot less pressure.
And what about that free childcare?
Yeah, and I've always been committed to that. So when I was working for Trevor Mallard as the Minister of Education, back a long time ago now, I was working on implementing 20 hours free early childhood education for 3 and 4-year-olds. As Prime Minister, I extended that to 2-year-olds. The current government have cancelled the extension to 2-year-olds, unfortunately. But I do think progressively increasing more access to free early childhood education, it's got benefits for the kids because we know kids who have been in early childhood education, quality early childhood education, do better when they go to school. But it also means that for parents, it's a huge easing of cost and it allows them to get back into work. And it will benefit women more than men, but there will be some men who will benefit from that too. So women are more likely to be the person who is at home looking after the kids. But increasingly now in this day and age, there are more dads doing that too. And free early childhood education really helps them to be able to go out and earn money as well as looking after the kids.
Right. So what's stopping us from just doing it tomorrow? Is it the money? Do we need to tax the rich?
We could have done 20 hours free early childhood education for 2-year-olds, and we had done that actually. The government took the money away from that to fund their family boost, which has been an absolute flop. 153 families, I think, have actually got the full amount of the family boost, which whereas every family with a 2-year-old would have got the 20 hours free and they wouldn't have had to fill in a form to get it. It just would have happened automatically. So a big saving for the family. So there is money there to extend that out over time to more, so you could potentially, increase the number of hours or increase the age groups who are eligible. I think that's something that we should certainly aspire to. And we can afford that as a country if we make the right choices. Bearing in mind that if we've got kids in early childhood education and the result of that is that their parents are then going back to work, those parents are going to be earning money and paying taxes, which is a good thing for government because it means that ultimately governments, and yes, we're spending more money on ECE, but we're getting more money because of the parents earning more money.
What do you think about taxing the rich?
I think I don't like the phrase. And the reason I don't like the phrase is because I think that tax fundamentally should come down to fairness. Everyone should pay their fair share. Everyone should make a contribution. We all benefit from health, education, the infrastructure that we build, things like roads. We all benefit from that. We all benefit from having a police force. We all benefit from having a good justice system. We all benefit from having a defence force. So we should all contribute to the cost of those things. And the tax system should be fair, which means those on higher incomes, and I am one of those people, should pay more. And I'm quite proud to say that I'm happy to pay more as someone on a higher income. I accept that, it's a great tagline,
It fits on a poster.
And it fits on a poster, but it creates a culture of resentment about taxes. Taxes aren't a punishment. Taxes are the contribution that we all make to living in a decent society.
In our poll, we asked, do you support or oppose the introduction of a capital gains tax on properties other than the family home? 46% of voters are in support of the idea, while 41% oppose it and 13% either don't know or preferred not to say.
I read something published on RNZ. This was in December, though, and it suggested that you will be campaigning on a capital gains tax at the next election and that, quote, details would be announced as early as mid-next year. Now, it's past mid-next year now. It's July now. Any word on that, how that might look?
Yeah, well, I've said that we'll announce our policy on that before the end of this year, because I think it is important, that is a big policy area. People want to know where they stand. Certainly people to my left, on the left of politics, get really excited about tax debates, and I understand that, but we also need to talk about how we get people into good, well-paid jobs, how we, generate more wealth for the country. And we need to do that as well as ensuring that the benefits of that are, fairly shared by everybody. And you can't have one side of that debate without the other. So tax is one of the ways we ensure that everybody, gets their fair share and pays their fair share. But we've also got to make sure that we're generating, good, well-paid jobs, that we've got businesses who are doing well so they can employ more people. And I don't think you can separate those two things. I think those two things do need to go together.
So you will commit to yes or no by the end of this year?
Yeah, and look, we're going to have a different tax policy to the one we had at the last election, very upfront about that. In New Zealand, I think we've placed far too much emphasis on buying and selling houses amongst ourselves, pushing up the price so that potentially a whole generation of homeowners is being shut out of the housing market, and not enough emphasis on productive investment, on building businesses that employ people, that allow them to earn more money. And our tax system currently encourages people to do that, to basically go and just speculate in the residential property market. And that's not going to make us rich as a country. So I think our tax system does need to change. I understand why mums and dads have gone out and said, I've got a house now, I can use the equity I've got in my house to buy a rental property and that can be my retirement savings. I understand why people have done that. The tax system's actually encouraged them to do that. But that's not sustainable. If every person who owns a house now buys another one, the next generation of homeowners won't exist. So we have to do things differently.
Do you think Labor will ever escape the COVID curse?
When you say COVID curse, I mean, it's challenging because it was hard. It was hard for the whole country. And it's actually really, I find as a politician, it's also quite hard to talk about it now because, did we get everything right during that time? No, I don't think we did get everything right. Were there lessons that we learned from that? Yes, of course. No one had ever done this before. No government had ever encountered what we encountered with COVID. Undoubtedly, there are things that if we could go back and do them differently, we would do some things differently. I can say that and then someone will ask me a specific question that'll be like, well, what about decision X? And so you explain the reasoning behind that decision and then they say, so you don't think you made any mistakes? I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just explaining why we made the decision we made at that time because there wasn't a rule book and it was hard. The management of the border was so hard because one of the ways that we avoided lockdowns, long, prolonged lockdowns in New Zealand, was by having the border restrictions in place that we had. But that meant that if you were travelling, if you had to travel for business, if you had family who were way overseas and they wanted to come back and see you or you wanted to go and see them, you couldn't travel freely in the way that we're all used to being able to travel. And that was really, really hard.
And some people have just gotten over the fact that we didn't travel for a couple of years and some people are still holding on to it, it seems. I mean, every time it must come up, you must, a little person inside you must just sigh.
A little bit, but I do understand because it was hard.
Yep.
And it really had a big effect on people's lives. But I guess the point that I would make is, yes, government decisions weren't perfect, but actually it was the virus and the global pandemic that caused a lot of the pain because the decisions the New Zealand government was making were not out of line with what other countries were doing. We were more successful, I think, partly because we're an island nation and we were able to isolate ourselves better in avoiding long, protracted lockdowns. I mean, I've got friends and family who are in the UK who spent a year and a half of rolling lockdowns. We avoided that here and we were able to live relatively freely during that time, other than, some periods where we weren't. And, for Auckland, that last lockdown was the hardest and it was hard. And that was one of the areas which I don't think we got it completely right. It went on for too long. And as we dealt with the new variants, remember we sort of shifted from COVID, early COVID to Delta to Omicron, and then we had moving from elimination, where we were aiming to just get back to what we'd been doing before, to realising that we couldn't and that we were going to have to deal with COVID in the community. That was very bumpy and very hard, and we didn't get every decision right in there, and I'd never say that we did. And so as a result, I think there are people who look at that going, if they'd been government, would we have made decisions differently? If we knew then what we know now, yes, unquestionably.
When it comes to election next year, Chris, are you still confident that you'll be leading the Labour Party?
Absolutely. And, look, I've still got a lot of energy for this job. I only took over, about 8 months before the election. I had 8 months as Prime Minister, and I said there, as soon as I took over from Jacinda, I want Labor to get back to focusing on what the Labor Party is all about: jobs, health, homes, making sure we're raising living standards for all New Zealanders, focusing on the things that unite New Zealanders rather than the things that divide us apart, making sure that where we're dealing with controversial and tricky areas like the treaty, for example, that we're slowing down a bit and we're bringing people with us. We're not, people don't feel like a whole lot's happening that they don't know about and they're mistrustful of that. I started that work when I became Prime Minister, and then, I still think that's work that the Labour Party needs to do. I think we need to make sure that we're there for the people who we represent.
And would you be open to working with the Greens and TPM, or have those conversations just not started yet?
Well, we work closely with them. Well, when I say closely, we cooperate with them quite a lot in opposition. And you'll see things like the Treaty Principles Bill, which we thought was a really divisive bill. We worked really closely with the Greens and with the Māori Party to oppose that and to make sure that it was defeated. We have a lot of values in common with both of those parties. If you're talking about the values of unity, of collective action, of making sure that we are catering to the squeezed middle, but also those on the lowest incomes, I think we share those aspirations. We want to make sure that we're leaving the planet in a at least as good a state as we found it. I think we share those goals. I've said that what we will do before the election, as I did last time, is I'll say, look, these are the areas that we've got in common with other parties, and these are the areas where we think we can work with them. And these are the things we categorically would take off the table. We won't do that. And I think that will make it clear what the future governing arrangements might look like. But I differ a bit from the current government in the sense that, I respect the important constituencies the smaller parties represent. And I also respect that we compete with them for votes too. I don't think under MMP the smaller parties should call all of the shots. I still think that the bigger parties have a mandate to reflect the view of a much larger section of the electorate. And so I do think under MMP, you need to kind of keep proportionality in mind. Yes, there should be some concessions and some trade-offs to the other parties in order to form government. But that doesn't mean that you should be doing things that you specifically told the electorate before the election that you weren't going to do.
Like the Treaties Principles.
The Treaty Principles Bill is a good example. The Regulatory Standards Bill, some of these things that no one knew they were voting for at the last election and now they're being inflicted on them. I don't think that's the spirit of MMP or democracy. I think, the majority should still rule in a democracy, and at the moment that's not happening. We're currently being ruled by a minority, a small minority, and I don't think that's what New Zealanders voted for.
And I can only assume David, not Winston.
When I'm talking about the minorities.
Yeah, who's the small minority?
Well, both of them to some extent on different issues. They've both got their hobby horses that they're sort of inflicting on the rest of the country. And they're not things that New Zealanders voted for.
Well, ending greyhound racing's not bad.
Look, I support Winston Peters on ending greyhound racing. I know the greyhound racers don't particularly like the fact that we're supporting the government on that, but it's time. And I said before the election that I thought it was time, and I congratulate him for doing it. Not everything in politics needs to be about saying I impose that just because it's the other side that are doing it. I think there's actually too much of that. And I also think let's make sure that when we're opposing each other, it's for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. So it shouldn't be it should be because we disagree, not because we're trying to, secure political advantage or political points. So things like infrastructure projects. Why does everything take so long in New Zealand, and why does it cost so much money? Well, the political cycle is part of the problem. New government comes in and says, we don't like all that stuff that the last lot were doing, so we're going to stop all of that and we're going to start again. Everything slows down, everything costs more money. And in the meantime, 17,000 fewer people are working in construction today than there were at the last election. And the government's part of the problem. I've said that I want to take a lot of the politics out of that. The Infrastructure Commission have come out with a big list that says these are the things that New Zealand needs. They're not things that political parties have decided. These are the things the Infrastructure Commission have said for a country of the size that we are, with the geography we are, this is what we need, and we need to do it. I've said to the current government, if you're doing stuff that is on that list, let's not fiddle with that. Let's just get on and do it, because that's been objectively determined that that's what we need as a country. And let's stop the stop-start nature of what we're doing, because not everything needs to be political.
And looking forward, Chris, what does a better New Zealand look like to you?
I think it involves higher standards of living for all New Zealanders. So people having good jobs, recognising that there's going to be turnover in jobs as technology changes, but that if you lose your job because things have changed, that you can get another one. If you need to retrain and reskill in order to do that, that you're supported to do that. That you can have a place that you can call home, whether it's owning your own home or having a security in your rental, that you can access good healthcare, that your kids are getting a good education, a world-class education, that we are actually, preserving the environment that we live in so that it can sustain future generations of people, and that we're living sustainably, that we're having a high quality of life, but in a way that's sustainable. To me, that's what New Zealand should be all about. There's huge opportunities for us. The move to a more sustainable way of living doesn't need to be a hardship. In fact, it could be the source of our great prosperity in the future.
Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Ethan Sills and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.